Let's get started. Story number 1.
The wind howled through the trees, sending gusts of rain against the windows with such intensity it sounded like 100 fists banging on the glass. The temperature had dropped rapidly since evening, and now, with the storm fully settled in, the house felt like it was freezing, despite the heater running full blast. Rachel sat alone in the living room of her cottage, wrapped in a thick blanket, a mug of tea in her hands. She loved these rainy nights. Well, most of them. This one, however, felt different. The silence between the gusts of wind was unsettling, almost too quiet, as if the world had paused for a moment. The air in the room seemed heavy, and her unease grew with every thunderclap. The power had gone out earlier, and now only the dull, flickering glow of a single candle illuminated the room. It should have been cozy, but it felt more like a trap. The house was old, very old, built sometime in the early 1800s, according to the previous owner. Rachel had been living here for just over a year, but in all that time, she hadn't grown used to the strange creaks and groans that echoed throughout the house. The old walls seemed to sigh with every gust of wind, and the floors had a tendency to settle in a way that made the house feel alive. She'd grown accustomed to these noises, but tonight they felt different. She took a sip of her tea, trying to push the feeling aside. She wasn't alone. Her dog, Milo, was curled up by the fire, his gentle snoring adding to the symphony of creaks. The dog was her companion and her only source of comfort in the remote cottage. He had always been a calm, easygoing animal, but tonight his usual peaceful presence felt distant. Milo shifted in his sleep, letting out a low, almost whimpering sound. Rachel glanced down at him. He looked uncomfortable. His ears were alert, his eyes half open, and his body was tense. He shifted again, his eyes locking onto the dark hallway that led to the bedrooms. Rachel felt a chill run through her. She'd seen Milo act like this before, eyes fixed on something that wasn't there, a low growl rumbling in his chest. But she didn't believe in ghosts. At least, she told herself she didn't. There had to be some rational explanation for his odd behavior. Perhaps the wind was blowing differently, or maybe it was the dark that unsettled him. "Hey boy, it's just the storm," she whispered, trying to reassure both him and herself. But Milo didn't relax. He sat up and turned his head, looking over toward the hallway. Then he stood, his ears fully erect, a low growl vibrating from his throat. Rachel's heart skipped a beat. She stood up slowly, setting her mug down on the coffee table. She could feel the air shift, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. Something wasn't right. The wind howled again, shaking the windows. That, and Rachel took a deep breath, walking cautiously toward the hallway. She tried to dismiss the feeling in her chest as overactive nerves. But as she stepped closer to the door that led to the bedrooms, she couldn't ignore the overwhelming sense of being watched. The hallway stretched out before her, dark and silent, and she could feel the cold creeping in from the farthest reaches of the house. Milo continued to growl, his gaze fixed on the darkened hallway. He wasn't being playful or protective. This was different, more intense, as if something had crossed into his line of sight that was beyond her understanding. Rachel stood frozen, her mind racing. She wanted to call Milo back, to tell him it was nothing, but her voice wouldn't come. The hairs on her arms stood up, and she realized that her feet were planted firmly in place, refusing to move forward or backward. It was then that she heard it. A faint creak. Rachel's breath caught. The house was old, yes, but there had never been a creak quite like that. It was soft, almost imperceptible, and it came from the end of the hallway, where the door to her bedroom stood slightly ajar. Her heart beat faster as she stepped backward, instinctively reaching for the lamp on the nearby table, though the power was out. Her fingers brushed against the cold metal of the base, and she snatched it up, gripping it in her hand as if it could protect her. Another creak. This time, it was louder, more deliberate. She wasn't imagining it. Someone, or something, was in the house. She turned to Milo, but his growl had deepened into a low, guttural sound. His body was rigid, staring unblinking at the hallway. Rachel swallowed hard, trying to ignore the creeping sense of dread that seemed to grow heavier with every passing second. She knew she had to check. She had to know what was going on. With her heart pounding in her chest, Rachel stepped forward, making her way cautiously down the hallway, the floorboards groaning underfoot with every step. The hallway was darker now, the candlelight at her back too faint to push into the corners. As she reached the bedroom door, she hesitated, her breath shallow, every nerve in her body screaming at her to turn back. But the door was still ajar. She slowly pushed it open with the tip of her finger, the old wood creaking under the slightest pressure. She could feel a cold draft coming from the room, and the temperature dropped significantly, as though something had sucked the warmth from the air. It smelled musty, damp, like an attic that hadn't been opened in years. And then she saw it. There was something in the room, a shadow. It was standing by the window, so dark it seemed to absorb the light around it. The figure didn't move, but Rachel could feel its presence, pressing against her like the weight of 100 eyes staring at her in silence. She wanted to scream, but no sound would come. Milo's growl intensified behind her, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from the shadow. It was tall, unnaturally tall, its edges flickering in and out like the flame of a candle caught in the wind. Then, as if in response to her presence, the shadow shifted. Rachel took an involuntary step back, but her legs felt frozen, rooted to the spot. She couldn't move, couldn't think, as the figure seemed to turn toward her. There was no face, no detail she could discern, just the overwhelming sensation that it was watching her, studying her. A voice, barely a whisper, but unmistakable, came from the darkness. "Get out!" Rachel's blood ran cold, and she bolted. She turned and sprinted back down the hallway, her heart racing, her breath ragged in her throat. Milo followed closely behind, his growl still echoing in the empty house. She didn't stop until she was in the living room again, slamming the door shut behind her. Her hands trembled as she grabbed the phone from the table, dialing the number for the local sheriff's office. But the line was dead. There was no signal. She looked up at the clock, but the time was frozen, an eerie, impossible stillness that seemed to stretch across the room. Milo sat beside her now, still alert, his fur bristling. Rachel didn't know how long she sat there, staring at the door, waiting for something to happen. The storm outside seemed to grow louder, as though it too was preparing for something. And in the silence that followed, she could swear she heard the faintest whisper again, this time coming from somewhere behind her. Leave. Her blood ran cold, and she knew that tonight she was not alone. Story the end.
Story number 2.
The rain was relentless, beating against the windows with an eerie consistency. The wind howled through the trees outside, its mournful wail filtering into the small, quiet house. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, a flickering warmth in the otherwise chilly air. Leah sat on the couch, her blanket pulled tightly around her shoulders, trying to drown out the unsettling sound of the storm. She wasn't usually one to get spooked, but tonight there was a nagging feeling in the pit of her stomach. It wasn't the storm that made her uneasy, though it certainly didn't help. It was something else, something she couldn't explain. The house was silent, save for the occasional gust of wind that rattled the windows. She had grown accustomed to the stillness of the old house since she moved in a few months ago, but tonight it felt oppressive, like the walls themselves were closing in around her. The silence seemed to stretch on too long, and the flickering lights made her feel like she wasn't really alone. Leah glanced at the clock on the wall. It was late, well past midnight. She had planned on staying up reading, but the unsettling feeling in the air had made it hard to focus. She grabbed her phone, hoping to distract herself with a text or an email, but when she unlocked the screen, there was nothing new. No calls. No messages. Her gaze shifted toward the hallway. The light at the end of the corridor barely illuminated the shadows, casting an eerie glow over the floor. It was so quiet, almost unnatural. There was something wrong about it. The air felt thick, heavy with a presence that she couldn't see. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, and she had to fight the urge to look away. Her breath caught in her throat, but when she did glance down the hallway, there was nothing there. But the feeling didn't go away. It lingered, pressing down on her chest like a weight. Leah shook her head, trying to dispel the growing unease. "It's just the storm," she told herself. "You're just tired, that's all." But still the feeling persisted, like invisible eyes were watching her, waiting for her to break the silence. A sudden creak from upstairs made her jump, and she quickly turned her head toward the ceiling. Her heart pounded in her chest. The old house was settling, she told herself, but the sound was unmistakable. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, heavy footsteps. Her eyes flicked nervously toward the staircase, and for a moment she almost convinced herself that someone was up there. But no one lived with her. She was alone. The footsteps continued, though, echoing softly from above. Leah held her breath, her pulse quickening. It wasn't the storm. This was different. She was sure of it. The footsteps paused for a moment, as though waiting before continuing, now louder, closer. Leah's stomach churned. She wasn't sure if it was the storm, the isolation, or something else entirely, but the tension in the house was growing unbearable. She glanced around, searching for something to ground her, but everything seemed off. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed deeper, darker, and the air was thick with an oppressive heaviness. A loud bang from upstairs made her jump, her heart leaping in her chest. Without thinking, she stood up, her legs shaky beneath her. She moved cautiously toward the hallway, her mind racing with every possible explanation for the sounds she was hearing. The wind, the house settling, maybe even a pipe or a branch tapping against the window. But deep down, she knew none of those explanations made sense. The hallway was dark, and the silence seemed to stretch for eternity. Leah's feet felt glued to the floor as she stared at the shadows beyond the dim light. Her breath was shallow as she took one hesitant step forward, then another. The footsteps had stopped, but the air felt charged with something she couldn't explain. She reached the stairs and stopped, staring up into the blackness above. A cold draft washed over her, making her shiver. She gripped the railing tightly, trying to steady her nerves. A few more creaks from above made her heart race, and she couldn't help but wonder if someone, or something, was waiting up there, watching her. With a deep breath, she started to climb the stairs, each step creaking under her weight. Her eyes darted from side to side as she reached the top of the staircase, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. The second floor was just as quiet and still as the first. The bedroom doors stood ajar, their darkened interiors empty and silent. Her mind raced, searching for answers. It's just the house, she thought again. You're imagining things. But as she moved down the hall, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She reached the door to the guest bedroom, the one at the end of the hall, and paused. For a brief moment, she thought she saw a shadow move behind the closed door. A fleeting glimpse, almost imperceptible. But it was enough to send her heart racing. Leah's hand trembled as she reached for the doorknob. The house felt colder now, and her breath came out in short bursts, fogging the air in front of her. The door creaked open slowly, revealing an empty room. The bed was neatly made, the curtains drawn tight against the storm outside. Nothing was out of place, but something was wrong. The feeling in the pit of her stomach had intensified. She stepped into the room, looking around at the shadows in the corners. The silence was suffocating. It felt like the walls were closing in, like the room was too small for her to breathe in. The air was thick with an unnatural heaviness. That's when she heard it again, a whisper, barely audible, coming from the corner of the room. Leah. She froze. Her eyes darted to the corner where the sound had come from, but the room was still empty. No one was there. The whisper echoed again, the voice soft but distinct. It wasn't her imagination. Someone, or something, was here with her. Her heart raced as she backed away slowly, never taking her eyes off the corner. The shadows seemed to grow longer, darker. Something was waiting, just out of sight. Then, the door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang, and Leah let out a scream. She tried to pull the door open, but it wouldn't budge. The coldness of the room pressed against her, suffocating her, and she could feel something, someone, behind her, just beyond the shadows. Leah. The voice was closer now, right behind her ear. She spun around, her pulse hammering in her chest, but the room was still empty. Her breathing came in frantic gasps as she slammed her shoulder against the door again, trying to force it open. Finally, the door gave way, and she tumbled into the hallway, gasping for air. Her heart pounded in her chest as she backed away from the room, her eyes wide with terror. She couldn't explain what was happening, but she knew one thing for sure. She was no longer alone in the house. She ran downstairs and grabbed her phone, her hands shaking as she dialed the only number she could think of. Emily, her best friend. The line rang, then clicked to voicemail. Leah's panic intensified. She couldn't stay here. She couldn't be alone. The footsteps started again, slow and deliberate, echoing from upstairs. She spun around, her body frozen in fear. The house was no longer silent. The presence was there, moving, waiting. Leah bolted for the front door, her legs moving on autopilot. She didn't stop to grab her coat or her keys. She ran out into the storm, the cold rain soaking her through, but she didn't care. She didn't stop until she reached Emily's house. She never returned to the old house. It stood there, empty, its windows dark, but every time the rain came pouring down, Leah couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was still waiting for her inside. Story, the end.
Story number 3.
The night was unnervingly quiet, save for the rhythmic sound of rain pelting against the window. It was one of those cold, rainy evenings when the darkness seems to stretch on forever, and every raindrop that taps against the glass feels like a soft whisper beckoning you into the unknown. It had been a long, tiring week for Jenna, and she was glad to finally settle down with a cup of tea in her cozy living room. The house, an old 2-story with creaky floors and weathered wood, was quiet except for the storm outside. It wasn't a large house, but it felt large when the wind howled and the shadows danced along the walls. Jenna had moved in a year ago, finding comfort in the peaceful solitude of the small town she'd relocated to. The house had character, and even though it had been vacant for years before she moved in, it never felt completely empty. She often imagined it had a personality of its own. Tonight, however, the house felt different. The silence was more oppressive, almost suffocating. Her hands wrapped tighter around her cup of tea as she gazed at the fire crackling softly in the hearth. The shadows on the walls seemed longer, darker, and every creak of the old house was a reminder that she was alone. She glanced at the clock, almost midnight. The storm outside had worsened, and the wind sounded like it was crying against the windows. The fire was dwindling, and the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen did little to mask the sense of isolation. The thought of being alone in the house wasn't usually enough to unnerve her. She was used to it by now. But tonight there was something unsettling in the air, something she couldn't shake. She had checked all the locks on the doors and windows earlier in the evening, but she found herself getting up again to double-check. She had always been meticulous, but the house felt too still, too alive in a way that made her skin crawl. She opened the front door, checking the locks and peering into the inky darkness outside. The wind howled, rattling the trees in the yard. Everything seemed normal, but when she stepped back inside, she felt it again. A shift in the atmosphere, as though something was watching her. Suddenly, she heard a faint sound from upstairs. A floorboard creaked, followed by the faintest whisper. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. Probably just the house settling, she told herself. It wasn't unusual for old houses to make strange noises, but the longer she stood there, the more the hair on the back of her neck stood on end. The whispering grew louder, more distinct, though still too faint for her to make out the words. It was coming from upstairs. She strained her ears, trying to listen. It was almost like a voice, soft but unmistakably there. Her mind raced, replaying everything she had heard about old houses. Settling noises. Pipes. Wind. It could be any number of things, she told herself, but the hairs on her arms were still raised, and her feet felt as though they were frozen to the floor. The whisper came again. Jenna, her name. It was so quiet, so faint, and yet it sent a chill straight through her. A shiver ran down her spine as she slowly turned toward the staircase. The shadows above seemed deeper now, as though the darkness had grown thicker since she had last looked. The whisper came again, more urgent this time. Jenna. It was closer now, closer than it had been a moment ago. Jenna's stomach churned. She didn't want to move, but at the same time she couldn't stay still. Her heart hammered in her chest as she felt an overwhelming need to investigate, to prove that it was nothing more than her imagination, nothing more than the wind or the house creaking under the strain of the storm. With slow, reluctant steps, she moved toward the staircase, each step creaking louder than the last. She glanced at the kitchen door as she passed it, half expecting someone to appear there. The house was silent again, save for the wind outside, but the whisper still echoed in her mind. Jenna. She reached the top of the stairs, and the air grew colder. She had never noticed how cold the upstairs was before, even on the chilliest nights. It was almost like stepping into a different world, one that was much older, much colder. The house groaned under the weight of the storm, the walls creaking and shifting around her. But the whisper was still there, faint but undeniably real. The bedroom door at the end of the hall was ajar, and it was from inside that the voice seemed to come. "Jenna?" The whisper again, barely audible but unmistakable. Jenna stood frozen in place, her hand gripping the banister tightly. She had always been skeptical of ghost stories, dismissing them as the imagination running wild. But tonight, she wasn't so sure. She wasn't sure of anything anymore. She hesitated, her feet unwilling to move, her mind racing with 100 possibilities. It could be a prank. It could be the wind or something that was playing tricks on her tired mind. But the voice sounded so real. It was as though someone was standing right there, just beyond the door, waiting for her to enter. Swallowing her fear, she forced herself to take a step forward, then another. The door creaked open, revealing the dimly lit room. The bed was neatly made, the curtains fluttering slightly in the breeze from the window. The room seemed unchanged, untouched, but something was wrong. The air was too still, too thick. Jenna stepped inside, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Her eyes scanned the room, moving from corner to corner. She saw nothing, no figure, no movement. Only the bed, the desk, the window, everything as it should be. And yet, the presence was there. She could feel it. The whisper came again, this time so close to her ear that it almost felt like a breath. "Jenna?" The voice was unmistakable. It was right behind her. She spun around, but the room was empty. There was no one there. Her pulse raced as she backed toward the door. The shadows in the room seemed to shift, growing darker and deeper. The walls seemed to close in on her, suffocating her with their weight. She was no longer alone. Someone was in the room with her. The floorboards creaked behind her, the sound so distinct, so real that she knew it couldn't be her imagination. She felt a coldness wash over her, a coldness that seemed to seep into her very bones. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her feet wouldn't move. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the whisper stopped. Jenna stood there, her heart racing, the hairs on her arms still standing on end. The room was silent once more. The weight, the presence, it was gone. She didn't wait for anything more. She bolted from the room, down the stairs, and out the door, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't stop running until she reached the neighbor's house down the street, where she stood, soaked to the bone, until someone opened the door and let her in. Jenna never returned to that house. She moved in with a friend and never looked back. The house stood empty, the rain falling against its windows, but no one would ever live there again. Not after the voice that called her name, not after the presence she felt in the darkness. And as the years passed, the house remained a quiet, forgotten relic, its whispers lingering in the cold and rainy night, waiting for the next soul foolish enough to enter. Story the end.
Story number 4.
The storm outside raged with ferocity, rain slashing against the windows like the sharpest of knives. The wind screamed through the trees, howling in a mournful tone that echoed across the small town. Inside, the house was warm and still, the only sound the occasional creak of the old timbers as they settled. It was a typical late autumn night, and Nora had every intention of getting a good night's sleep after a long day at work. But tonight there was something wrong. She had lived in this house for over a year now, an old Victorian place that had always felt strange, though she'd never been able to put her finger on it. The walls were thick with history, the creaking floorboards a constant reminder that the house had witnessed decades, if not centuries, of stories. The neighbors swore it was haunted. They claimed to have heard voices in the middle of the night and seen shadows moving through the windows. Nora had always laughed it off. Her skepticism ran deep, and besides, the house was her sanctuary. But tonight, as the storm raged and the shadows in her home seemed to stretch further than usual, her usual comfort was starting to slip away. The power had gone out an hour ago, and the only light she had was from a small candle flickering on the dining room table. The warmth of the flame did little to push back the chill creeping through the corners of the room, and her thoughts kept drifting back to the strange feeling that had started to settle over her when the wind picked up. Nora sat in the living room trying to distract herself with a book, but every few pages Her eyes darted to the darkened hallway that led to the back of the house. There was something unsettling about the darkness tonight. The hall stretched out impossibly long, and she could feel the weight of it pressing in on her, like a presence watching, waiting. A sudden gust of wind rattled the window panes, causing Nora to jump. She cursed under her breath, trying to shake off the nervous feeling that had settled over her. She hated feeling like this. She wasn't afraid of storms. She wasn't afraid of ghosts either, despite the rumors that floated around town. She was an independent, level-headed woman. She wasn't some silly child spooked by shadows. Yet something still made her uneasy. She glanced at the clock on the mantel. It was nearly midnight. The thought of going to bed should have been comforting, but she hesitated. The bedroom was at the far end of the house, and the hallway between felt like a dark abyss, too long and too quiet for her liking. With a sigh, she stood up, grabbing her candle and making her way toward the back of the house. She had to face it. If she wanted to sleep at all tonight, she had to pass through that hallway. The floor creaked beneath her feet as she moved, the old boards groaning under her weight. The hallway seemed to stretch farther than it had ever before, and every step she took only made the darkness seem deeper, more suffocating. She could feel her pulse quicken, but she refused to acknowledge it. She was being foolish. As she reached the halfway point of the hallway, she paused. There was a strange noise, a soft scratching sound, almost imperceptible, coming from behind the door at the end of the hall. Her heart skipped a beat. It was like something was dragging across the floor. She stood perfectly still, her breath caught in her throat. It didn't sound like the wind. It didn't sound like the house settling either. It was coming from inside the room. A sudden gust of wind slammed into the windows, rattling the panes. But Nora didn't flinch. She couldn't take her eyes off the door. The noise continued, scratching and dragging. Then, for a moment, it stopped. Her mind raced. Was someone in there? She had lived alone for months, and she knew the house was secure. But the scratching, it wasn't something her mind could explain away. Slowly, almost against her will, she took a step forward. Another. And then, without warning, the door creaked open. Nora froze, every muscle in her body tense. The door opened just a crack, revealing only darkness beyond. No light, nothing. Just the pitch blackness of the room. Her instincts screamed at her to turn and run, to leave the house, to get away from whatever was happening. But something she couldn't quite explain, kept her rooted to the spot. The scratching had stopped, but the door was still open, and in the silence she could almost hear her heartbeat, loud and frantic. Then she heard it. A voice. It was faint, like a whisper, and it came from somewhere deep in the room. She couldn't make out the words, but there was no mistaking the cold, empty tone. Come in. It was not a request. It was a command. The voice was hollow, distant, like it didn't belong to anyone in this world. A cold shiver ran down Nora's spine, and for the first time since she moved into this house, she felt an overwhelming urge to flee. But before she could turn, before she could take a single step up, the wind outside howled louder than before, and the door to the room slammed shut with such that the house shook. Nora gasped, her hand flying to her chest. Her heart was pounding wildly in her chest, her breath coming in short gasps. She didn't know what was worse, the feeling of being watched or the eerie silence that followed. She glanced at the door once more, her mind torn between running and staying. Slowly she reached for the door handle. With a deep breath, she turned it. The door creaked open, but this time the room was empty. It was as if nothing had ever happened, just a simple, cold bedroom with a dusty old bed and empty shelves. The scratching was gone. The voice was gone. Nora stepped inside cautiously, her candlelight flickering uncertainly in the dark. She glanced around the room. Nothing seemed out of place. The house was old, and the wind was fierce tonight. Maybe the sound had come from the storm outside. Maybe her nerves had gotten the best of her. But as she turned to leave, something caught her eye. A small, old mirror hung on the wall across from the door. It wasn't the mirror that caught her attention. It was the reflection. For a split second, just as her candlelight flickered, she saw something, or someone, standing behind her in the reflection. It was a figure, tall and thin, dressed in old, tattered clothing. The face was obscured by shadows, but she could feel its presence, like it was breathing down her neck. She spun around in a panic, but there was no one there. Her heart raced, her breath coming in quick gasps. She slammed the door behind her, her pulse pounding in her ears. She had to leave. She had to get out of this house. Nora rushed to the front door, grabbing her coat and bag, but before she could open it, the lights flickered on. The entire house seemed to breathe a sigh of relief as the storm outside seemed to subside, the wind dying down, the pressure lifting. But something was wrong. She was still terrified. She could still feel the presence lingering, just out of sight. Nora made her way back to the living room, trying to steady her racing heart, but the unease wouldn't leave. She couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. Then in the stillness, she heard the faintest whisper. Leave. The voice came from the darkness of the hallway, the voice that had commanded her earlier. Her heart leapt into her throat, and she bolted out the front door, running into the cold, rainy night, leaving the house behind. But as she glanced over her shoulder, she could swear she saw a shadow watching from the window. Story the end.
Story number 5.
The storm had rolled in quickly that evening. What had started as a light drizzle by dusk had quickly turned into an all-out downpour by nightfall. Leah sat in her living room, curled up on the couch with a blanket wrapped around her, a cup of tea in her hands. The rain hammered against the windows, the occasional rumble of thunder shaking the house. The wind howled, its eerie sound seeping through the walls. She'd been living in this house for over a year now, a small cottage just outside of town, surrounded by trees. It was old, no doubt, with creaky floors and a fireplace that barely worked, but she liked it. The isolation gave her a sense of peace. On nights like this, when the storm raged outside, she felt cozy in her little house, safe and warm. But tonight was different. There was something about the air, a heaviness she couldn't explain. The wind seemed to push against the house more forcefully than usual, and the trees outside bent in unnatural ways. The rain was harder than she had ever seen it, the drops almost slapping against the window. The house groaned as if it were settling into the storm. Leah shivered, though the blanket around her was thick and warm. She glanced over at the clock on the wall. It was nearing midnight. The house, usually quiet, now seemed to echo with strange sounds. The wind was loud, but every now and then a soft creak would pierce through, seeming to come from somewhere deep within the walls. The hair on the back of her neck stood on end. She told herself it was nothing. Old houses made strange noises, pipes, the wind, the house shifting. She had heard it all before, but tonight it felt different. It felt as if the house was alive in a way that it never had been before. Something was watching her. A flash of lightning illuminated the room for a brief moment, followed by the boom of thunder. Leah jumped at the sound. As the thunder faded, she thought she heard something. A faint noise, almost a whisper. Her heart raced. She had grown accustomed to the sounds of the house, but this was something new. A soft, distant sound, like footsteps coming from somewhere upstairs. Leah tried to dismiss it as the storm, the wind, or even her imagination. But the footsteps continued. They were slow, methodical, like someone was walking across the floor above her. The sound was unmistakable, distinct. There was no one else in the house. She stood up slowly, the blanket still around her shoulders, and walked cautiously toward the stairs. The wood creaked under her feet with each step, the sound amplifying in the silence of the house. She paused at the bottom of the stairs, staring up into the darkness. The hallway at the top was black, no light at all, save for the occasional flash of lightning that flickered through the windows. The footsteps stopped. Leah's breath caught in her throat. There was nothing but silence now, the storm outside the only noise. She took another step forward, the creaking of the old floorboards sounding deafening in the quiet. Her mind raced. Could it have been an animal? A branch scraping against the window? Another creak echoed through the house. It was coming from upstairs again. Without thinking, Leah grabbed a flashlight from the table by the door and started up the stairs. The beam of light bounced across the worn wooden steps as she climbed. The sound of the storm outside filled her ears, but inside it was eerily quiet. She reached the top of the stairs and stopped. The door to the bedroom was closed. The silence was suffocating. She pushed the door open slowly, her flashlight illuminating the dark room. The bed was undisturbed, the curtains drawn tight. There was no one in sight. Her heart thudded in her chest as she moved further into the room, her flashlight sweeping over the furniture, the corners of the room. Nothing. She let out a slow breath, but the sense of unease didn't leave her. She was alone in the house. Of that she was certain, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That presence she couldn't explain. It was like a weight pressing down on her chest. Suddenly, the sound of something scraping across the floor broke the silence. It was loud and unmistakable, coming from the far corner of the room. Leah turned sharply, the beam of light landing on the small wooden dresser in the corner. It was moving. The dresser, sliding slowly, as if being pushed by some unseen force. It stopped just a few inches from where it had been. Leah's heart pounded in her ears. She couldn't breathe, couldn't move. Her entire body froze in fear. The dresser had been stationary, sitting in the same spot since she had moved in. It had never moved. There was no logical explanation for what she was seeing. Her mind screamed at her to run, to get out of the room, to leave the house. But her feet wouldn't move. The air was thick with dread, and her flashlight trembled in her hands. She glanced back at the door, the hallway beyond it shrouded in darkness. A voice broke through the silence. "Leah?" Her blood ran cold. The voice was faint but unmistakable. It came from the corner, the same spot where the dresser had just moved. It was soft, almost like a whisper, but it clearly called her name. She turned slowly, her body unwilling to cooperate. The darkness seemed to grow thicker in the corner, as if the shadows were alive. And then she saw it. Just for a moment, she thought she saw a figure, a shape, moving within the shadows. It was tall and indistinct, its form blending with the darkness. The figure was still, but Leah could feel its presence, could sense that it was watching her. "Leah," the voice called again, and this time it was louder, closer. She couldn't take it anymore. The terror that had been building inside her exploded. She turned and ran out of the room, stumbling over the threshold and into the hallway. She didn't stop to think. She didn't stop to look back. She just ran down the stairs, nearly tripping over the last step as she crashed into the living room. The house groaned again, as though it were alive and shifting beneath her feet. The wind outside had picked up, rattling the windows, but all Leah could hear was the pounding of her own heart. She grabbed her coat and rushed to the door, throwing it open into the storm. The rain hit her immediately, cold and relentless, but she didn't care. She ran out into the yard, her feet slipping in the mud as she bolted toward the street. Leah didn't stop running until she reached the neighbor's house, where she pounded on the door, gasping for air, her eyes wide with terror. Her neighbor, a middle-aged woman named Sarah, opened the door, her expression immediately turning to concern as she saw Leah's frantic state. "Leah, what is it? What's wrong?" Sarah asked, pulling her inside. Leah couldn't speak at first. Her chest heaved as she tried to catch her breath. "There's something in my house," she finally managed to choke out. "Something. It's there." Sarah frowned, but she didn't question Leah further. She closed the door behind her and led Leah to the couch. The storm raged on outside, but inside Leah felt safer, though the unease still lingered in her gut. She never returned to that house. Despite all of her efforts to go back, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for her there, something that wasn't quite human. The house remained empty, sitting in the storm, alone in the dark as the rain continued to fall. Story the end.
Story number 6.
The rain hadn't stopped for days, and tonight it was heavier than usual. The sound of it hitting the roof, slapping against the windows, was constant. A thick, rhythmic pounding that almost drowned out the other sounds of the night. The wind howled through the trees, sending a chill through the air. It was one of those cold, miserable nights that made everything feel damp and alive in an unsettling way. Lena sat on the couch in her small cottage, her hands wrapped tightly around a mug of tea. She had grown accustomed to living alone in the country. It was peaceful, most of the time. But tonight, in the midst of the storm, something felt different. Something felt off. The house was quiet except for the storm outside. The familiar creaks of the floorboards seemed louder than usual, the house settling with every gust of wind. She tried to focus on the book in her hands, but the words blurred in front of her eyes. Every so often, she would glance toward the dark hallway that led to the back rooms of the house. It felt like someone was watching her. She shook the thought away. It was just the storm, she told herself, nothing more. But then she heard it. A soft sound, almost imperceptible at first. A scraping, as if something was being dragged across the floor. The noise came from the far end of the hall, near the kitchen. Lena's heart skipped a beat. She put the book down and listened, straining to hear it again. Nothing. It could have been the wind, she reasoned, or the house settling. She had heard noises like this before, small creaks and groans that came with living in an old house. But tonight, for some reason, they felt different, more deliberate. A sudden gust of wind made the trees outside bend violently, and the windows rattled. The noise came again, this time louder, like something heavy being moved across the floor. Lena stood up, her legs trembling slightly. The idea of staying in the living room was suddenly unbearable. She had to check. The hallway was dark. The only light came from the small lamp she had left on in the living room, casting long shadows across the floor. She hesitated for a moment, standing at the threshold, the weight of the silence pressing down on her. The air felt colder now, a chill that seeped into her bones, making her feel as though the house itself were holding its breath. Taking a deep breath, she stepped into the hallway. Her feet moved silently across the old wooden floors, each step feeling too loud in the stillness. As she neared the kitchen, she could see the faint outline of the door, slightly ajar. The scraping sound stopped. Lena reached for the handle, her fingers trembling, and slowly pushed the door open. The kitchen was empty. There was no sign of anything out of place. The table sat undisturbed, the dishes from her earlier meal still left on it. There was no sign of anyone. But as she stood there, staring into the darkened room, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The cold air seemed to settle around her, making her skin prickle. Then, from behind her, she heard it. A voice, soft and barely a whisper. Lena. The hair on the back of her neck stood up. She spun around, but there was nothing. The hallway was empty, the shadows deep and unwelcoming. She stepped back, her heart racing, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The voice had been so close, so real. She rushed back into the living room, the door to the hallway slamming behind her. The sound of the storm outside felt deafening now, a constant roar that drowned out everything else. Lena's mind raced, her thoughts a jumble. What was happening? Who was in the house with her? She glanced at the clock. It was well past midnight. The house felt cold now, the fire in the hearth crackling but not warming the room like it usually did. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something was waiting for her. Suddenly, there was another noise, this one unmistakable, a knock on the door. It was soft, slow, but distinct. One knock, then another. She froze. Who could it be? It was storming so fiercely outside, and no one would be out there at this hour, especially not in the rain. Lena's mind raced. She wasn't expecting anyone. There were no neighbors nearby. It didn't make sense. The knocking continued, this time more insistent, the sound growing louder, as though someone was getting impatient. Lena felt her legs tremble, but she forced herself to move. She had to see who it was. She had to know. Slowly, she approached the door, her hand reaching for the handle. The room seemed to darken around her, the shadows stretching longer, the chill in the air making her breath come out in little visible puffs. She opened the door, just a crack, peering out into the storm. There was no one. The porch was empty. The wind whipped the rain into her face and the trees swayed violently, but there was nothing there. The doorframe was clear, the path leading down to the road invisible in the rain. Lena stepped outside, the cold water soaking into her slippers. She looked around but saw only darkness, the storm obscuring everything beyond a few feet. She called out, her voice barely audible over the howl of the wind. Hello? Nothing answered. There was no one. She turned to go back inside, but as she did, something caught her eye. There, in the window across the room, a figure stood. A tall, dark shape, staring out at her. Her heart stopped. She knew the house was empty. There was no one else here. The figure in the window was clear now, its shape defined, standing motionless as it watched her. Lena's pulse quickened, and she turned to run back inside, slamming the door behind her. But as she spun around, her eyes met the figure again. It wasn't in the window anymore. It was in the living room. It was standing in the doorway, right there in front of her. Her body froze. The figure was tall, too tall, its shape blurred in the shadows. Its face was obscured. The only thing visible were two glowing eyes like deep pits of blackness. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. And then, in a voice that was not her own, a voice that came from the figure in front of her, she heard it again. Lena. The sound was cold, devoid of any emotion, but it struck her to the core. Her mind raced. What was it? Was it a person? A shadow? A ghost? Her thoughts couldn't keep up with the terror that seized her body. Suddenly, the figure moved, lurching toward her in one jerky motion. Lena screamed and stumbled backward, tripping over the edge of the coffee table and crashing to the floor. The candle by the window flickered and went out, leaving her in darkness. The figure moved closer, its feet scraping against the floor, dragging something behind it, just like the sound she had heard earlier. Lena scrambled to her feet, eyes wide with panic. She had to get out. She had to escape. She bolted for the door, flinging it open, and ran out into the rain. The wind bit at her skin as she sprinted down the path, the cold water soaking her through. She didn't stop. She didn't dare look back. But as she ran, she could still hear it. The sound of dragging footsteps behind her, getting closer with every step she took. Lena, the voice followed her into the night. Story the end.
Story number 7.
It was a cold and stormy night when Claire found herself alone at home. The house unusually quiet despite the cacophony of the wind and rain outside. She had been living in the house for a little over 2 years, a charming, albeit old cottage, tucked away in a secluded neighborhood on the edge of town. The house, built in the early 1900s, had its quirks: creaky floorboards, drafty windows, and a tendency to make noises at night. But Claire had grown accustomed to it. It had been a long week at work, and she'd been looking forward to a quiet night of reading and relaxing. The rain against the windows was soothing, the wind outside creating a gentle howl as it whipped through the trees. She lit a candle on the coffee table and curled up on the couch with a blanket, a steaming mug of tea in hand. The storm, however, had a way of making the house feel different. It was as if the sounds outside made every little creak of the house seem louder, more pronounced. She tried to shake off the feeling, but the house, despite its warmth and comfort, felt eerie that night. The temperature had dropped significantly, and even with the heating running, she couldn't shake the chill that seemed to settle in her bones. Claire had just started reading a book when she heard it, a faint noise coming from upstairs. It wasn't loud, just a soft, scuffling sound. She paused, glancing up toward the staircase. Her heart skipped a beat. She was alone, at least she should have been. Her mind raced. It was probably just the wind or the house settling. She'd heard strange noises before. Old houses did that. But the noise came again. This time it sounded like someone was walking around upstairs. Slow, deliberate steps that echoed in the silence of the house. She set her book down, her breath coming a little faster now. The house wasn't big, and she knew every corner of it. The upstairs was quiet, dark, and unused for the most part. No one should be up there. Her pulse quickened as she stood and walked cautiously toward the stairs. She listened intently, straining to hear anything over the sound of the storm. The noise stopped. Claire hesitated at the foot of the stairs, unsure of what to do. She glanced at her phone. No messages, no calls. She had double-checked the locks earlier in the evening, and she knew the windows were all secure. She was just being paranoid, she told herself. It was just the wind, or maybe an animal had gotten into the attic. Taking a deep breath, she began to ascend the stairs, her feet making faint creaks on the old wood. The darkness at the top of the stairs seemed thicker than usual, almost suffocating. She paused at the landing, the hair on the back of her neck standing on end. The house was silent again. No footsteps, no sounds at all. She turned down the hallway, her flashlight in hand, scanning each room as she passed. She was getting to the end of the hall when she noticed the door to the spare bedroom was slightly ajar. That door had always been closed, ever since Claire had moved in. It was the room that her parents had used when they visited, but now it stood open, the shadows inside dark and heavy. Claire's heart skipped again. She slowly approached the door, her breathing shallow. She couldn't explain it, but something felt wrong. She had an overwhelming sense that she wasn't alone, that someone or something was watching her from the darkness beyond the door. Her hand trembled as she pushed the door open. The room was cold, the air inside thick and musty. There was no one there. Everything appeared normal, just an old bed, a dresser, and a small desk in the corner. Yet the room felt off. The air was heavy, dense, and Claire couldn't shake the feeling that she had interrupted something. A sudden sound from behind her made her whip around. A loud creak like someone had stepped on the floor in the hallway. Her heart raced as she turned toward the door, her flashlight shaking in her hand. But the hallway was empty. Then the door slammed shut behind her. Claire spun around, her breath coming in sharp gasps. The door? How had it? She didn't remember closing it. Her eyes went wide as she struggled to turn the doorknob. It wouldn't budge. The door was locked from the inside. Panicked, she pulled on the knob harder, her fingers slipping from the cold metal. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. "Is someone there?" There was no answer, only the deafening sound of her own heartbeat. The room seemed to grow colder still, the air so frigid it hurt to breathe. Then she heard it. A soft, low voice, so faint she almost missed it, whispered her name from the corner of the room. "Claire." She froze. The voice wasn't hers. It wasn't human either. It was distant, hollow, as if it was coming from the walls themselves. It sent a chill down her spine that made her blood run cold. She glanced toward the corner of the room, the shadows so deep that they seemed to pulse with something alive, something waiting. "Claire," the voice repeated, louder this time. Her heart hammered in her chest as she backed away toward the bed, her flashlight still flickering in her hand. The room was impossibly cold, and the darkness seemed to grow thicker, pressing in on her from all sides. Her breath was visible now, clouding in the icy air. The shadows in the room shifted, the figures seeming to twist and move, but she couldn't tell if it was just the darkness playing tricks on her. With a burst of adrenaline, she yanked the door open, stumbling out into the hallway. She ran down the stairs, hardly feeling the cold seeping through the soles of her feet as she dashed toward the front door. The house groaned, the floorboards creaking under her weight as she raced through the darkened rooms. She didn't stop until she was outside, gasping for breath as the cold rain hit her face. She stood there for a moment, the storm raging around her, trying to calm her racing heart. Her thoughts were a blur. The house, the voice, the shadows, they all felt so real. But how? She stood there in the downpour, unsure of what to do. The storm had only gotten worse, the wind howling as the trees bent under its force. She could hear the rain pelting the ground in a steady beat, but for some reason, the air felt still. Too still. She turned to look at the house, the windows dark and empty. Nothing moved, no sign of life or movement inside. It looked the same, just as it had when she had left it hours ago. But somehow it felt different. The darkness of the night seemed to stretch around it, suffocating the cottage as if it were part of something far larger than it should be. She didn't go back inside that night. She couldn't. The terror she felt lingered, and no matter how much she told herself it was just her imagination, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was in that house, waiting for her to return. In the morning, the storm passed, leaving the world outside wet and muddy. She returned to the house, but the door wouldn't open. The locks were jammed, as if someone had sealed them shut from the inside, and despite all her efforts to get it open, Claire never managed to unlock the door. She moved out of that house soon after, never able to explain the things she had seen, the voice she had heard, or the cold that had crept into her bones. But she never looked back. The house stood empty, abandoned once more. And the next time the rain came, Claire made sure she wasn't alone. Story the end.
Story number 8.
It was one of those nights when the cold felt like it reached into your bones and the rain, relentless and heavy, drowned out every other sound. Emily sat curled up on the couch in her small old house on the edge of town, a cup of tea in her hands, trying to relax after a long day at work. The storm had rolled in just after sunset, and by now, the howling wind outside had made the house feel like it was being engulfed by something far larger than just a storm. The power had flickered once or twice, but the lights had stayed on, and the room was warm with the soft glow of a few candles. Her cats had found their spots, curled up on the rug by the fireplace, content to sleep through the chaos outside. Emily took a sip of her tea and tried to focus on her book, but the sound of the storm was unsettling, and the house creaked ominously as the wind rattled the windows. She'd been living in this house for nearly a year now. It was old, built in the 1800s, and it had that distinct musty smell of age. Sometimes she would hear things at night, scratching noises or the occasional floorboard creaking when she was sure she was alone. She didn't pay much attention to it. After all, old houses made strange sounds. But tonight, as the storm battered the windows, she felt a creeping sense of unease. The clock on the mantel read 11:45 p.m. The wind outside intensified, and for a moment, Emily could have sworn she heard a distant voice. Faint, almost like a whisper. But it was gone as quickly as it came. She shook her head and glanced around the room, her unease growing. Her cats were still asleep, oblivious to the storm, and the house was silent again. Maybe she was just imagining things. She stood up, stretching, and made her way to the kitchen to refill her tea. The sound of the storm outside grew louder, and the occasional crash of thunder made the walls of the house shudder. As she filled the kettle, Emily felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. Something was wrong. It wasn't the storm. It was something else. The hair-raising sensation of being watched crept over her, as though unseen eyes were on her. She paused, straining her ears, but heard nothing out of the ordinary. The only sounds were the rain pounding against the roof and the kettle starting to boil. Still, the feeling lingered. Something was off. She walked back into the living room and sat back down on the couch, trying to ignore the uncomfortable feeling gnawing at her. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and tried to focus on her book again, but her mind kept wandering. And then she heard it. A soft, unmistakable tapping. It came from somewhere deep in the house, from upstairs. It was faint at first, like the sound of a finger gently tapping against the wood, but as it continued, it grew louder, more insistent. Emily's heart skipped a beat. The sound was deliberate, rhythmic, like someone or something was knocking on a door. She froze. The cats shifted restlessly on the rug, their ears twitching as though they had heard it too. Emily's breath caught in her throat. There was no one else in the house. She had checked the doors and windows earlier that evening, making sure everything was locked tight. But the tapping continued, unmistakably coming from the upstairs hallway. Her first thought was that it was the wind, or maybe the house settling. But it sounded too deliberate, too persistent for that. She grabbed her phone, her fingers shaking as she typed a quick message to her friend, asking if they had heard anything strange in their own homes tonight. She didn't know why she felt the need to reach out. Maybe she just wanted some kind of confirmation that she wasn't losing her mind. No reply. The tapping continued, unrelenting, as if whoever or whatever was making the sound was growing impatient. Emily set her phone down and stood up, her legs heavy with dread. Her feet moved on their own accord, almost as if they were being pulled toward the stairs, drawn by an invisible force. She tried to tell herself it was nothing. The house had a lot of quirks. Maybe it was just the storm playing tricks on her. But as she slowly climbed the stairs, the tapping grew louder. And then it stopped. A sudden, suffocating silence filled the house. Emily's heart thudded in her chest, her breath shallow as she reached the top of the stairs. The hallway stretched before her, dark and oppressive, the dim glow of the moonlight from the window barely enough to illuminate the room. The door to the bedroom at the far end of the hall was slightly ajar, and from where she stood she could see that it was pitch black inside. The house felt colder now, the chill creeping into her bones as if the temperature had dropped suddenly. Her hand instinctively reached for the light switch, but she hesitated, the silence too thick, too unnerving to break. And then she heard it again, the soft tapping. But this time it was coming from inside the room. Her breath hitched in her throat. The tapping wasn't from the hallway anymore. It was right behind the door. "Hello," she called out, her voice barely above a whisper, her heart pounding in her ears. There was no answer. She reached for the door, her hand trembling. As she pushed it open, the room was revealed to be as empty as it had been before. The bed was undisturbed, the curtains swaying gently in the breeze, the only light coming from the faint moonbeam that streamed through the window. But then, she saw it. On the floor near the foot of the bed was a trail of wet footprints leading toward the closet, the faint imprint of muddy, dripping shoes in the carpet. Emily's blood ran cold. The footprints weren't there before. She was certain of it. She'd made the bed just a few hours ago. There was no one else in the house. But now there were wet, muddy tracks, as though someone had walked through the room just moments before. A cold gust of wind rushed past her, sending a shiver down her spine. The storm outside was growing fiercer, but the wind in the room felt different, unnaturally cold. She looked back toward the closet, the door slightly ajar, and heard the unmistakable sound of something or someone shuffling inside. The tapping had stopped, but now there was something worse. The sound of breathing. It was slow, deliberate, and shallow. Her hand reached out toward the closet, and she could feel the weight of the air pressing against her chest, heavy with dread. Her mind screamed at her to run, to leave the room, to leave the house and never look back. But her body was frozen in place. The breath caught in her throat as her fingers brushed the edge of the closet door. With a sharp, quick movement, she swung it open. The closet was empty. The air in the room was still for a long moment, and she stood there, trying to convince herself that everything was fine. But the room was colder now, far colder than it had been when she first entered. The air felt wrong, unnatural, charged with something dark. Something was in this house with her, something that didn't belong. And then she heard it, clear, unmistakable. A voice, low and guttural, whispering from the darkness of the closet. Leave. The breath froze in her lungs. She spun around and bolted from the room, running down the stairs, her feet tripping over the steps. She rushed through the living room, her heart pounding wildly in her chest, and grabbed the door handle. But the door wouldn't open. She pulled and twisted the knob, but it was stuck. Her panic rose as the sound of footsteps echoed through the house, coming closer, closer. Someone or something was walking toward her. Leave. The voice was behind her, cold and clear. With every ounce of strength she had left, Emily wrenched the door open and ran into the storm, her body drenched instantly from the downpour. She didn't stop running until she reached her neighbor's house, breathless and terrified. They never found out what happened that night. The next morning, when they checked her house, there was nothing unusual, just an empty, quiet home. But Emily never went back. She never spoke of it again, but the image of the muddy footprints and that whisper, leave, haunted her every night thereafter. Story the end.
Story number 9.
The rain drummed steadily against the windows, and the wind howled like a distant voice calling through the night. Laura sat curled up on her couch, a thick blanket wrapped around her shoulders, staring at the flickering light of the old table lamp beside her. It was past midnight, and the power had been cutting in and out all evening. The storm outside was getting worse. She lived alone in a small house at the edge of town, a place she had inherited from her grandmother. It was old but cozy, and she had spent the last year fixing it up, making it her own. But tonight, the familiar comfort of her home felt different. Off. It started with the shadows. At first, she thought it was her imagination. The dim lighting combined with the storm played tricks on her eyes. But then she saw it clearly. Something moved in the hallway, a dark shape, shifting just beyond the reach of the lamp's glow. Her breath caught. She stared, her fingers clutching the blanket. Maybe it was just the way the light flickered. She told herself that. But the feeling of being watched settled heavily on her shoulders. She reached for her phone and checked the signal. No service, typical during storms. The Wi-Fi was down, too. She was completely cut off. Taking a deep breath, she forced herself to relax. Maybe she was just on edge. She had been watching horror movies earlier, after all. But then she heard it, a soft creak. The sound of a floorboard shifting in the hallway. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She wasn't imagining it. Someone or something was in the house. Slowly, she stood up, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. The rain outside masked other noises, but she strained to listen. Another creak. Closer. She turned her head toward the hallway. It was pitch black beyond the doorway. She hadn't left any lights on back there. A cold chill ran down her spine. She wanted to call out, but fear trapped the words in her throat. Then something moved again, closer this time. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but her body refused to move. And then, in the darkness, she saw it. 2 pale, lifeless eyes staring at her from the hallway. Her breath hitched. The figure stood just at the edge of the shadows, its form barely distinguishable. But the eyes, those terrible, hollow eyes, locked onto hers, and then it stepped forward. The dim light from the lamp revealed it, a gaunt, withered figure. Its skin stretched too tightly over its bones, its mouth hanging open as if trying to form words but failing. Laura stumbled back, her heart hammering. The figure moved, jerky and unnatural, like a marionette being dragged forward. It raised one bony hand and pointed at her. A whisper filled the air. Not from the thing, but from all around her. "You're not alone." The lamp flickered violently, and for a split second the room plunged into darkness. When the light returned, the figure was gone. Laura gasped, her whole body trembling. She didn't dare move. Her mind screamed for her to get out, but fear rooted her in place. Then, behind her, the whisper came again, closer this time. "You're not alone." The icy breath on her neck sent her into motion. She spun around, but there was nothing there. She ran. Bolting for the door, she fumbled with the locks, her shaking hands barely able to grip them. The storm raged outside, but she didn't care. She had to get out. Just as she yanked the door open, the power went out completely, plunging the house into darkness. The whisper was right behind her now. "You're not alone." With a scream, she ran out into the rain, barefoot and blind in the storm. She didn't look back. She couldn't. She ran until she reached her neighbor's house, banging on the door like a mad woman. When they finally answered, she collapsed inside, gasping for breath. She tried to explain what she had seen, but the words wouldn't come out right. They called the police, and when they searched her house, they found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no footprints, no one there. But Laura knew the truth. The thing in her house wasn't an intruder. It had always been there, and it was still waiting for her to come home. Story the end.